Chapter 39. Chapter 39 covers dangerous and big dramatic scenes. So hazardous materials, multiple casualty incident, and incident management. First off, this chapter alone is not at all an extensive look at these topics. There are several other additional required trainings that you need to have in order to appropriately and efficiently operate on these scenes, particularly hazardous materials. The substance that we have for hazardous materials in the EMT class is just really the tip of the iceberg. We generally will have you take, if you haven't completed a formal hazardous materials awareness or above class prior to taking an EMT course, we give you the online Cliff Notes version of it, as well as chat about it a bit more here in the text. But that being said, it really is more of a orientation to it. It's not even an awareness. Now, remember the purpose of EMS providers on a hazardous materials scene is to simply be aware that it is a scene, identify that it's a scene, and stay the heck out of the scene. Now, as you continue your education and become wiser and more experienced within the EMS systems, you may become part of a specialty hazmat team of EMTs that does decontamination and treatment in the warm and hot zones and so on and so forth. But really, hazardous materials awareness tells you this is a hazmat scene and stay out of it. So you certainly can work your way up through if you so choose, but again, not all inclusive by any means. Multiple casualty incidents, MCIs, and incident management. We are going to touch on both of those topics. There's significantly more information that you can obtain on, and each system kind of handles multiple casualty incidents a little differently as far as triage. Incident management is another thing that you're going to need to have additional education in. The bare minimum for EMS professionals is NIMS ICS 100 and 700, although many agencies want you to have 100, 200, 700, and 800, and FEMA is constantly coming out with more and more of those trainings. So a lot of them are mandated to all emergency responders, that all law enforcement, EMS, and fire have some basic hazmat and basic incident management classes. FEMA requires these for a lot of grant training, or a lot of grant funding, I should say. So your objectives, several of them located in the book on 1006 and 07. Kind of a lengthy chapter here. Again, if you have not taken a formal hazmat awareness class or above, you have to have documentation on file that you have satisfied those requirements, and that's most likely going to be from a little online opportunity that we have set up. Additionally, you will have to have on file prior to completing the course documentation that your NIMS and ICS 100 and 700 are completed. Those are our education standards and are required. So you have to make sure that those are completed and submitted to the program director as soon as possible. So our core concepts to cover in this chapter is how to identify and take appropriate actions in a hazardous materials incident, how to identify a multiple casualty incident, our role in a multiple casualty incident, discuss the incident command system, how to triage, specifics on transportation and staging logistics, and the psychological aspects of multiple casualty incidents. So we'll start with hazmat. So what are hazardous materials? They are any substance or material in a form which poses an unreasonable risk to health, safety, and property when transported in commerce, which is a definition by the United States Department of Transportation. So these are substances that, and a lot of these things are things we use around the house, but in greater volumes become a much bigger problem. So there are a number of levels of training. Hazardous materials, first responder awareness is now, they say it's a no minimum number course. In most places it takes about 6 hours to complete that, depending on the formalities and what other resources they involve. Hazmat first responder operations. This is roughly 8 hours beyond that of what you got in awareness. And a lot of places it takes you could do both awareness and operations in roughly 16 hours or so. Those people that are doing awareness are basically identifying that it is an issue and staying away from it. Operations is identifying that it's an incident, staying away from it, and trying to keep it from going anywhere. Hazardous materials technicians are those that are going in and plugging, patching, and stopping the release, whereas ops is probably putting up little dikes and dams to keep things trying to somewhat contain. And then the specialists are those that would go on and start the cleanup process. You can move on to instructor and commander and so on and so forth. But so it's roughly 24 more hours to get to tech, 24 more hours on top of that to get to specialists. So, there's a lot of training involved, and a lot of annual refresher training that goes on with that as well. So on a hazmat scene, what is it that we do? We first of all recognize it's a hazmat scene. We control the scene as far as try to keep people out of the danger zone, try to put a halo of safety around the incident, and if it is possible and safe, we will attempt to identify the substance. So when we're recognizing it, it's simply just keeping your eyes, ears, and senses open to know, hey, this is not right. Something doesn't look right. One of my, I don't know if I should call it favorite or least favorite hazmat incidents that I ever worked was I was on the ambulance crew. We got called out for a hazardous materials incident standby with the fire department. The fire department takes care of all the hazmat stuff. We're just there for moral support, and show up, and we're sitting and we're sitting and we're sitting. We got the story that there was a truck moving cargo, multiple substances and chemicals inside, and it was leaking some fluid out of the back of the truck. Somebody called it in. Law enforcement got the guy off the road, and they decided, yeah, this is probably a hazmat incident. We need to get out of there. Well, after fire gets on scene and starts to do more and more investigation, they see there's a pink liquid that is dripping out of the back of the truck. They determined through looking at all kinds of the resources, bill of lading and whatnot, that they could probably try to go and attempt to figure out what was going on. So somewhere around 6.5 hours later, the substance was identified as a leaking barrel of dish detergent. So we spent 6.5 hours sitting on scene for leaky dish detergent. So, but it was better to be safe than sorry, and so recognizing it was somebody seeing that there was liquid dripping out of a truck. Controlling it, basically saying, from the information we have, we know that we need to evacuate people in this zone, and we need to try to keep people out of that zone. So they use the terms hot, warm, and cold zone. Hot zone is the immediate area directly around the hazmat incident in which they strongly suspect that bad things would happen to anybody. Warm zone is a buffer in which that's where a lot of the decontamination will occur, and a lot of the operations that are preparatory are occurring. And then the cold zone is where everybody's on the outside, basically looking in and remaining safe. When can we identify the substance? We can identify that substance using a couple of resources, binoculars, the NFPA placard system, and then the diamond-shaped dot or DOT labels, which you can identify several of these on pages 10, 10, 10, 11 in your textbook. So there's the NFPA 704 system, which is the red, blue, yellow, white diamonds, 0 being pretty safe, 4 being extremely unsafe, and then there's obviously in white specific hazards. But and then binoculars to identify the standard placarding system, like you see in 39-2. You could look up 1866 in your resources and find out what that substance specifically is. You can use material safety data sheets, which if you get chemicals in any quantity, particularly for commercial use, you will have to have an MSDS sheet, which identifies a lot about the chemicals themselves, such as what to do in case you're exposed, who to call, a lot of the properties that go with it, any fire hazards, so on and so forth. Bill of lading, invoices, and manifests, which are required for various shipping routes. Obviously talking to people about what is it, what's in there, what comes from that, what do you do with that. That's all important. Now, and to add on to this, we not only have to have a way to kind of identify it, but we also need to have something to then reference. So this is often called the Orange Book or the Emergency Response Guidebook. It used to be referred to as the North American Emergency Response Guidebook. The intent was to have this book in every emergency vehicle in Mexico, the United States, and Canada. It gets updated every few years. It seems like it's probably on about a 4 to 5 year cycle. You can get additional information from it. There's lots of info in there you can get. So you would see that that placard 1866 or any of the other placards that you see on page 1012. You can start to look up the numbers and find out what exactly is it that we're dealing with there. You're not going to get the specific chemical, but you're going to get the very close chemical class. And then there are also lots of other hazmat materials, resources. There's smartphone things, computer things you can download, hotlines you can call. Speaking of hotlines, Chemtrec and Chemtel, and then there are several other governmental authorities that can be used, as well as poison control. We don't think of poison control for hazmat, but it is a poison. Poison control does have information on the treatment of patients exposed. So there are some places you can get into contact with. The Chemtrec, Chemical Transportation Emergency Center, it has that 24-hour hotline you can call, and it's an 800 number. So, they will be able to help coordinate resources to assist there. And then Chemtel is very similar. It's another large organization that helps respond. I'm trying to remember. I believe one of them is really more geared towards the companies, and Chemtrec, I think Chemtel is one more geared towards companies and transportation, and Chemtrec is, I believe, more geared towards emergency response. Talked about the zones. We have the hot zone where it's bad, warm zone where we're kind of doing the work, and that's the buffer, and then the cold zone where we're staging and whatnot. We have the treatment area. So eventually, if we have people that are exposed to these chemicals, we're eventually going to have a place to treat them. So the treatment area, the rehab operation, so if we're dealing with firefighters or hazmat personnel, they're dealing with this, we need to have resources to take care of them as they're coming out. Just like fire people, firefighters get hot, they get dehydrated. We need to take some accommodations then for our hazmat crews as well. Protect them from the weather, keep them, warm them up if they're getting cold, cool them down if they're getting hot, get them something to eat occasionally, get them hydrated. Those are all important things. We also may need to be treating them for some things. Maybe we do get a dehydration out of the deal. Maybe we get somebody has a shortness of breath or a heart attack. We're also going to need to potentially be able to deal with those. Make sure it's large enough to accommodate multiple rescue crews, and that it's easily accessible to EMS units should somebody require transport. Additionally, in our treatment area, we probably have a separate area from rehab that's the injury treatment zone. And on the way to the treatment area, there usually will be a decontamination area. And the decontamination area, they're going to do a couple things. The gross decontamination, where they are probably going to get to strip and get a quick spray down, and then a secondary decon where they're going to be a little bit more concerned with getting everything scrubbed off. So we may have a quick decon that gets them initially out of their gear and the major amounts of chemical off of them, and then the secondary removes like the residues and whatnot. So we may have a person walk through a misting fire hose initially with their gear on. That gets most of the chemical off. Then they doff their gear, and then they may go through a formal shower with some soap and whatnot. So some other mechanisms for decontamination: ultimate emulsification is the production of a suspension of ordinarily immersible or unmixable insoluble materials that use basically a surfactant or a soap to remove chemical reaction. It's basically a neutralizer, or I guess if you wanted to use a more medical reference, a antidote more or less to the substance. Disinfection. Disinfection would be used in biologics. So if we're dealing with some sort of a live virus, fungus, bacteria, we would disinfect it. Dilution. This is just basically drowning that baby with tons and tons and tons of water or another type of solvent. Typically we'd say water, but and it dilutes it. So you may have had a ton of it on you, but by the time you are rinsed off with 5,000 gallons of water, it's not so big anymore. Absorption and adsorption is a penetration of liquid or gas into another substance. So water soaking into a sponge, so if we can soak it up some way. Removal, so this might be something vacuuming, brushing it off, wiping it off, something along those lines. And then disposal, this is the aseptic removal of contaminated object from the host, after which the object is disposed of. So basically we're tossing it out. All right, so decon procedures for victims wearing versus not wearing PPE. We've got those kind of listed here in the text on 1018. Talks about rinsing them from the head and working down. You don't want to work up towards the head because you're most, well, with the exception of your genitals, some of the most absorbent areas of your body are on your head. They'll generally scrub the suit with a brush at the head, work down. They're also trapping all this water, remember. This doesn't just run off. You rinse them again from the head, working down, assist them from removing their PPE, and then obviously continuing that runoff. If they're not wearing PPE, then the responder safety, of course, is important. we may think we need to be a hero and go running in there and try to save this person, but remember, we have to do the best for the most. So you should use public address system or megaphone or something to instruct them to remove as much of their clothing as possible and leave it behind because this clothing is trapping those materials up against them. If they have contact lenses, they have watches, so on and so forth, remove those things. Double bag their clothings and whatnot. Valuables and ID can be bagged. Potentially later can be salvaged. And then next, receive a 2 to 5 minute water rinse to get all the solid and particulates off. It may be advisable to brush some of those off. But something to also keep in mind is there are chemicals that react very violently with water. So we would want to be cautious. Hopefully if we have an idea that that's potential, we would want to brush that off obviously before. And then protecting them. So, and then there'll be, after the rinsing, usually a shower and a lower pressure system. And they probably will have some soaps and emulsions or whatnot. And then they're given basically some either paper garments or some secondhand garments to wear in order to keep them decent. We move on to multiple casualty incidents. Here's an example of a multiple casualty incident. We have a bus rollover. Obviously have a large number of people that have been involved here. From this scene, it's almost confusing to see who is actually hurt and who isn't. So if you stop and look twice at it, you'll note that there's a significant number of responders here. So this may look a little worse than it actually is from face value. But a multiple casualty incident or multiple casualty situation is an event that taxes the EMS system. So basically, when you no longer can handle the incident with your resources. So if you have one ambulance in your town and 4 EMTs, a good car wreck could be a multiple casualty incident. Remember, most ambulances are capable of hauling 2 patients, 2 real patients. Granted, in odd situations, you're going to load that baby up with walking wounded and whatnot. But patients who actually truly need care, we can take care of 2. So, one ambulance, 4 EMTs, a car crash with 6 people involved. That's a multiple casualty incident. So it's overtaxed your system. You have to call for outside departments to assist for mutual aid. So things that are important about a multiple casualty incident is to pre-plan this thing. Decide how are we going to handle this? What are we going to do should this happen? So hopefully before it ever comes to reality or to fruition, we have started to consider this. Who are we going to call? Who is the next closest? Who do we have mutual aid agreements for what areas of our response district? Who else can we call? Is there, you may think of, well, let's think of the Omaha Council Bluffs Metro. You think, well, Omaha Fire, Council Bluffs Fire. You might be thinking, okay, well, that's the 2 biggies. But when you stop and really look around and say, well, I think Omaha typically staffs about 16 ambulances, 15, 16 ambulances. Council Bluffs usually has 3 or so. Where are we going to get more ambulances? Should we have a plane crash or something? Well, you stop and look, and you've got places. You've got the Carter Lakes and Underwoods and Lewis Township, Pacific Junction, Plattsmouth, Bellevue, Papillion, La Vista, Gretna, Ponca Hills, Irvington, Bennington. You have a handful of private ambulance services within the metro area, so at least 3 significant companies. So there are more potential players in the game. So you have to stop and think about that. What are we going to do? Who are we going to call? Is it well publicized? People need to be able to find out what the disaster plan is. It's not something that should be locked up in the chief's notebook in the chief's office. It needs to be, everybody needs to know it. It needs to be realistic and it needs to be rehearsed. So from time to time there needs to be drills, whether they're tabletop or they're actual drills, that kind of practices how are we going to do this, should we actually have to. Everybody's eventually going to have to. Nobody wants to, but they're eventually going to have to. So, and is it really realistic? I mean, can we really say that we're going to have these resources available? Well, let's throw another look at maybe the Omaha Metro. Should something big happen? Well, if I say that there's 14, 15, 16 ambulances in Omaha Fire's fleet, and we have a multiple casualty incident, does that say we can devote 14, 15, 16 ambulances to that incident? Well, remember, the rest of the world doesn't stop turning when a multiple casualty incident occurs. So if we take all 15, 16 ambulances responding to this incident, who's going to respond to the other 911 calls that keep coming in? So that's things that have to be considered. How else are we going to be affected by this? All right, so the National Incident Command System, or the National Incident Management System. The National Incident Management System, hopefully you've gone through 100 and 700 so already and you're kind of familiar with this. But this is an organized system that basically starts to allow us to break down an operation into manageable chunks and components. In even the smallest scale incidents, a lot of departments use this. You'll hear them establishing, one engine company arrives on scene and they're establishing, what's Main Street Command. And that's kind of the start of that. Should it develop into something bigger? The incident management system really has multiple facets to it, so it can continue to grow depending on the type of incident, the size of incident. Obviously there is command. Command is the person that is in charge. Depending on the type of system that they operate in, that you operate in, command may be a single person that's in charge, or it may be something referred to as a unified command. A lot of times in a single incident command, this is usually a fire chief that's taken charge here. You can also have a unified command, which is probably the better model. When you have a unified command, you have police, fire, EMS, public works, and other people that are involved in making these decisions. There may or may not be an official figurehead in charge of this. In the systems that work the best, you have unified command because everybody has different priorities. If we talk about going to a car accident, if we go to a car accident, we have EMS, fire, and law enforcement all responding. Law enforcement's worried about traffic control and then investigating the accident. Fire's worried about whether something catches on fire and they need to cut up a car. And EMS is worried about taking care of a patient. So we all have different angles we're approaching it at. So a lot of times we need to work together. So some good ways to look at this is I am in no way, shape, or form an expert at cutting apart cars. Yes, I've done it, but when I've gone on scenes in which I needed somebody extricated or cut out of a car, I go to the incident commander for the fire side and say, here's the situation. This is the patients that I need out. This is the priorities. I don't care how you do it, but let's get that person out first. And usually they're more than willing to try to accommodate that. You have some subordinate operations or subordinate areas that go along with this. Operations, planning, logistics, finance. So these all can be then further even broken down to talk about various other aspects of what they do. So when we're talking about the operations, it's usually what's actually physically boots on the ground doing. planning may be looking at how are we, what are our next steps, who do we call, where do we go. Logistics might be how are we going to have enough bandages and oxygen for this, and then finances, really how are we going to pay for this. Eventually this all costs money, eventually something's going to have to come down here. So, and it may be tracking, where did we get this from, where did we get that from. So communications obviously is very critical, and it becomes a big mess when we have multiple casualty incidents. So upon our arrival, we're going to give a brief report and request necessary resources, and the incident commander is the only person to converse with the communications center and disseminates information to others. And we often will have face-to-face conversations among command staff whenever possible. So we all know that if we go on a call and we have multiple trucks responding, it instantly makes the radio traffic a mess. Well, let's take that to 100 times that size. The sheer amount of radio communication is just going to be a disaster. So if we're getting on scene, in most cases we're not even going to tell dispatch we're on scene. We've arrived on scene. We let whoever our contact on scene know. The incident commander speaks a lot, probably through a proxy, so they'll allow dispatch to know what's going on, so to try to eliminate as much unnecessary traffic. So some of our branch functions and what we do, obviously there may be somebody that's located in the command center, maybe talking, here's our concerns, here's how we're going to, here's some resources we're going to need. Extrication, whether or not we actually are the ones cutting, probably not. We're usually responsible for the next several things, where we're going to be talking about staging, and staging is where we're going to put equipment until we need it. In some instances, ambulances will show up at a scene and they're told drop all your backboards and proceed to the next part of the staging area. So they may be saying we need all the resources, put them here, and then we'll divvy them up as necessary. Staging is where you sit and wait, and are held until a time in which you're assigned a duty or a job. Sometimes that's no time at all, and sometimes it's a lot of sitting. Triage. Triage is definitely the EMS thing, as is treatment and transport, but triage is the sorting of the casualties. So we're going to assign specific categories to the patient based on their condition, and that's going to help us determine who goes where and who goes when. Treatment is not always complicated. It's not always as in-depth as it would be in a single patient incident, but the treatment area is usually really based on salvaging life and limb. We're not as concerned with every specific detail usually because we just have too many people to deal with. Transportation may not also be as pretty. It may be modified because we have two patients and one person's trying to take care of them. We may have yet even a third person sitting up front, simply they need a couple of stitches. So transportation and rehabilitation, we're probably going to be involved with rehabilitation should people become ill or become injured in the process. So triage. Triage is a French word for the sorting of casualties. The goal is to afford the greatest number of people the greatest chance of survival. I'd like to put it even simpler than that. Do the best for the most. So how can we benefit the most people? This is often a difficult thing for new people to do, simply for the fact that it's kind of against some of our instinct. Is we want to help everybody. In triage, that's not always possible. So we prioritize our patient in our primary or initial triage. We have 4 categories of patients. priority 1 or the highest priority, we're usually talking about a triage tag system here, and these people would be assigned a red. If you look at 1031 in your text, you can see an example of a triage tag where priority 1 is marked red. It's got the rabbit on it. Go fast. This is a treatable life-threatening illness or injury. Priority 2, these are serious but not life-threatening injuries, so they can be delayed a bit. Priority 3, these are our walking wounded. So these are people, they have minor things that we'll eventually need to do something about, but they're not going to die anytime here soon because of what they have. And then priority 4 or 0, depending on your category, these are the dead or fatally injured. So in the terms of a triage tag, priority 1 is red, priority 2 is yellow, priority 3 is green, priority 4 is black. So we're talking colors. So we have START. START is a simple triage and rapid treatment. This is a commonly used triage system throughout the United States. The foundation of it is based off of speed, simplicity, and consistency. And we give some simple commands to patients. And the patient evaluation is based off of their RPM, or their respirations, pulse, and mental status, which is truly some of the major life threats. Helps us identify those, just like we would in a primary assessment. So to start your triage, first of all, you basically could stand there and say, if you are able to walk, come over here. And say, if you're able to walk, come sit over here by this red car. Anybody who is able to get up and walk over to the red car is instantly classified as priority 3, green, walking wounded. So that sorts those guys out. That does not mean they're going to stay green forever, but in the initial sort, we got them out of the mix. So if they were not able to walk, then we start going person by person and check for respirations. If their respirations are present and greater than 30 per minute, so very fast, they get priority 1. If it's less than 30 per minute, we move then down the line to check a pulse. We'll come back to that. If they have no respirations, we're going to open their airway and check for respirations and then assign based off of that. If still no respirations, they're dead. Okay. We don't have time because in order to work a cardiac arrest, it takes 3, 2, 3, 4 providers to work that. We don't have the resources to do that. And that's going to take one whole ambulance and a lot of resources out of the way for somebody who we know in 98% of the time is going to die anyway. Sound cold? Yep. But you have to look at the volume of the situation. So if we get passed on down to pulse, if they are unresponsive, not breathing, and no pulse, they're dead. Priority 4, black. So if they're breathing but have no apparent pulse, they're priority 1. We may be able to do something with that. But the reason that is if they're breathing, they do have a pulse. It just may be so weak we can't find it yet. So if they're breathing, they have a pulse, they have good skin signs, and good capillary refill, then we're going to check their mental status. If they're alert, they're priority 2. If they're altered, they're priority 1. So our color coding again, red, yellow, green, and black. So this chart can be found on 1028 in your text. Kind of simplifies it for you. So, if you're able to get up and walk away, you're green. So those people are all out of the way. Respir's present, and if it's, we'll say, within normal limits and decent, then within normal limits and decent, then we're going to go and say, is it greater than 30 per minute? No. We're going to keep moving down the line. If it is greater than 30 per minute, we assign them a red. So if they're less than 30 per minute, and they have a good pulse and good skin sign, we keep moving down the line. If not, they're red. And then we look at their mental status. Can they follow commands? Yes, they're yellow, or priority 2. No, they're red. If the respirators were not present, open the airway, see if the respirators are present. Yes, they're red. No, they're black. So this is all basic instinctual stuff, but this helps try to put some sense to it. All right. Patient identification before we move on to staging and logistics. Patient identification, normally we are assigning the patient a triage tag or some sort of a identifier. Most triage tags, and as we flip to 1030, we can see, or 31 actually, we can see that this is a triage tag. Typically has a piece of string through the hole that can be put around the patient's neck and hung basically as a necklace. There's obviously in the white areas, there's places to make some notes about what you found. Once you finally get around to doing vital signs on them, when they make it to the treatment area, then you can write vitals and whatnot on there. You can make some pictures on there, what you found as far as injuries. If there's a way to identify the patient a little bit, any specific medical information, you can put that on there as well. You will tear off starting from the bottom of the tag. When you assign them their initial triage priority, you tear off up to that. So you can get worse. So if you started out as a green and then later ended up unresponsive but still breathing, you would then end up as a red. They could go back and tear off the green and the yellow and still have the red tag hanging there. And then obviously once you've gone dead, you remain dead. But you also see the yellow corners up in the top there. And all it simply has on there is an identification number. And those identification numbers, one can be given to the hospital, one can be taken by the transporting ambulance, and that just helps track this patient through the system. So transportation and staging logistics. Triaged and treated patients. So once they've been triaged, they're moved to an area with all their like-colored peers. So all the reds are in one area, all the yellows in one area, all the greens in one area. And that lets you know where to give the resources to. Obviously, all the blacks are in an area. Usually that's away from everybody else because that's the deceased. So, so once they've been triaged and initially treated with some basic things, maybe an oral airway, maybe oxygen if it's available, and some bandaging, they can then be considered for transport. The ambulances wait in a staging area until they're called upon to you'll be told go to the yellow treatment area and pick up some patients and transport them to XYZ hospital. So receiving facilities are contacted early to determine their capabilities, and there's usually some fairly routine contact between command or communications and those facilities. So the facilities may say we're overwhelmed, we can't take any more, just don't send any more. Or they may end up saying we have fewer patients than we expected, so bring more. Psychologically speaking, when we're talking from an MCI standpoint, your caring, honest demeanor can be very reassuring to the patient, but it also very, very difficult for the patient as well as yourself to deal with this situation. It's not something that anybody is even prepared to deal with because it's so overwhelming. So talking with the patient, you're not psychoanalyzing them, you're not going to be able to fix this problem, but just to be helpful and reassuring is critical and key here. Psychological first aid may be necessary. Well, again, that's something you can take in an additional course, but it's very simple. Very simple stuff that you're just simply talking about being kind, being caring. So, all right. So, think about it. You're the first rescue vehicle to reach the scene of an MCI. What should you do? Typically, I don't answer these for you, but if you're the first one in, whoever is the senior EMS professional on scene is the incident commander. So the incident commander is in charge. The second person, then driver or what have you, is then going to need to start to perform triage. All right, in review, be suspicious. Hazmat incidents start out as routine calls. Remember hot zone, warm zone, cold zone. Patients have been decontaminated, may still be contaminated, don't forget. Use your MCI plan and procedure at small incidents, and larger ones will be easier when they occur. So that's why sometimes you have a 2-patient car crash, you might start an MCI plan. Learn and practice start triage. There's a version for kids called Jump Start. Be alert for the signs of stress and seek help as necessary. Remember, hazmat responses require specialized training and resources. No way, shape, or form are you prepared to deal with hazmat incidents other than to identify and stay the heck out of them. Scene safety, of course, will remain the highest priority in all of our incidents. A little bit higher in hazmat and MCIs and crashes and whatnot. Use as many scene clues as possible. Use your resources to try to help identify and determine how far you need to be keeping people out. Decon prevents the spread of hazardous materials in theory, and EMTs may be involved with this process. You'll need to have additional training if you're going to be. MCIs are going to overwhelm all of our resources, and when this occurs, we have to try to remain organized. NIMS and the ICS provide us a structure that helps us manage these incidents. And triage allows EMTs to prioritize the care and transport of patients when resources are limited. So questions for you to consider. What is a hazardous material or a hazardous substance, and what risk does it pose? If the patient is contaminated, what can we do to safely decontaminate them? And should I start using the triage tags? Your critical thinking question for this chapter: your cause a motor vehicle collision with an unknown number of injuries. As your unit approaches the scene, you see that 3 cars and downed wires are involved, and you get a whiff of gasoline as you pass by. The drivers are visible in each vehicle. One appears to be conscious, the other 2 are bent forward or slumped back. There are passengers visible in 2 vehicles, one or more of whom need extrication. How do you proceed? Well, our call is a motor vehicle collision, unknown number, and as our vehicle approaches, we see 3. So from this assumption, we believe that we're the first vehicle on scene. Somebody needs to establish command, and somebody is going to need to make sure that we are getting the appropriate resources en route, which could be the command. If it is safe to approach, which it is appearing to be less safe with down power lines and gasoline, we may need to start some triage, and if possible, have people self-extricate themselves out of there. And as many of them that can get out of there and proceed to a safe zone would be a good idea.